Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's victim story, I know it's annoying, but I need to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel here. I'm a new and small channel on YouTube, as you can see, and a simple click on the like button can help me a lot. So please subscribe to support me, click the like button and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Now, let's get to the case. Ellie Parker stepped out of the small boat and into the warm embrace of the ocean. The air was thick with humidity, but the sea breeze cooled her skin as she carefully made her way down the boat's ladder. She could feel the salt water creeping up her legs as she waded into the shallow, crystal-clear waters of the Great Barrier Reef. The moment her feet sank into the soft sand, a sense of calm washed over her. It had been a long journey, and the research team was finally here on the edge of one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. The sun was already high in the sky, the light refracting through the water in a dazzling array of blues and greens. Ellie took a deep breath, savoring the moment. This was why she'd studied marine ecology for the past 4 years. To be here, in the heart of one of the world's most important habitats, was the culmination of everything she'd worked for. "All right, everyone, let's get to work," Professor Daniel Hughes called out from the boat, his deep voice carrying across the water. He was the team's leader, experienced, practical, and as passionate about marine biology as anyone Ellie had ever met. Ellie nodded and looked around at the others. Thomas, a quiet, brooding graduate student with a fascination for underwater photography. Lena, a seasoned diver with more experience than Ellie could ever hope to have. And Jackson, the team's tech expert, who was always tinkering with gadgets and gear. Together, they were here to study the coral reefs, to collect water samples, and to document any changes in the environment, particularly the health of the ecosystem in the wake of climate change. She felt a flutter of excitement. This was real research, this was real science, and it was going to be incredible. "Ellie, you're in charge of collecting the water samples today," Daniel said, looking at her as he adjusted his diving mask. "Lena, take the transect line and map the reef. Thomas, you're on photography. Jackson, keep the boat steady. Let's stick to the plan." Ellie smiled and nodded, adjusting her own mask. She and the others had spent the better part of the last week preparing for this day, gathering their gear and getting the logistics sorted out. Now it was time to put everything into motion. "Got it," she said, pulling a waterproof clipboard from her bag. She checked the list of sample locations, a few points along the reef to measure water quality and some specific coral clusters. That had been identified in the previous study. Simple enough. With a final glance at the team, Ellie turned and swam out to the designated area. The water was warm, buoyant, and almost intoxicating in its beauty. Schools of fish darted around, her flashing silver and gold. The coral formations beneath her were vibrant, bright reds, yellows, and oranges pulsing with life. She felt at home here, surrounded by the ocean. As she swam towards her first sample site, she tried to memorize every detail of the reef. How the water felt, how the light shifted across the corals, how the life pulsed around her. She had studied these reefs in books, but nothing compared to the reality of being there. "Remember to keep it steady, Ellie," Daniel's voice crackled over the radio in her ear. "We don't want to disturb the ecosystem too much." "I'll be careful," Ellie responded, adjusting her position to make sure she didn't touch any of the delicate coral with her fins. She knelt down in the water, securing her first sample container to the metal rod that she had driven into the sand. Her gloves made the task a little slower, but it was all part of the process. Behind her, she heard Thomas's camera snapping away, capturing the beauty of the scene. The sound was familiar and comforting. She didn't mind being in the spotlight for the research. In fact, she relished it. This was the life she'd always imagined for herself. As Ellie worked, she began to lose track of time. She was absorbed in the task at hand, carefully collecting water from different depths and angles. Her surroundings faded into the background, and for a moment she forgot about everything else. Then a sudden movement in the water caught her attention. At first it was a blur, just a shadow darting beneath the surface. Ellie froze, instinctively holding her breath. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart starting to race. It was probably nothing, just a fish or a dolphin, something harmless. But she couldn't shake the sense of unease that crawled up her spine. She scanned the water, her heart thudding in her chest. The shadow was gone, but something felt off. It wasn't right. Her instincts were on high alert now. "Daniel, you seeing this?" she asked, her voice tight through the radio. "Something's moving around me." There was a pause before Daniel's calm voice came through. "What kind of movement? Fish? Shark?" Ellie's throat tightened. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the water felt too still. Everything around her seemed eerily quiet. "I'm not sure," she said. "It's moving fast, and I don't think it's a fish." There was another long pause, this time longer. "All right, Ellie. Stay calm. Just get back to the boat. We'll have a look from here." Ellie turned her body slightly, still scanning the water. Her pulse quickened. She could feel the faintest tremor in the water, like something large, something alive, was moving just beneath the surface. Her breath came faster now. The unease she had dismissed earlier began to bloom into full-blown panic. "Ellie, get back to the boat." Daniel's voice was sharper now. "Now!" Ellie didn't need any more encouragement. She turned, swimming back toward the boat. Her arms and legs moved faster, each stroke harder, as if she could outswim the anxiety that was gnawing at her. The water that had once felt so welcoming was now terrifying, unfamiliar. Suddenly, the water beneath her shifted violently. Ellie barely had time to react. A flash of grey, a mass of muscle and teeth. The shark's dorsal fin cut through the surface with chilling precision. Ellie gasped. She tried to move, to swim faster, but the predator was already upon her. The water seemed to explode around her as the shark launched its attack. Pain. White-hot. Searing pain as the shark's teeth clamped down on her leg. It felt like fire, and Ellie screamed as the shock of it nearly sent her into unconsciousness. Blood began to pour into the water. Her body instinctively jerked away, but the shark was relentless, twisting and pulling with terrifying strength. Ellie fought with everything she had, kicking and thrashing, but the shark held on. She could hear Daniel shouting through the radio, the team's frantic voices lost in the chaos of the attack. "Ellie, hold on, we're coming!" But it was too late. The shark's grip tightened. Ellie's world became a blur of agony and panic. Everything around her dissolved into chaos. Darkness, water, pain. She didn't know which way was up, didn't know if she was still alive. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shark released its hold. The water went still again. The shark was gone. Ellie lay there, trembling, barely conscious, her mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. She could see the boat now, her team scrambling toward her. Jackson was shouting something, but the world felt muffled, distant. Her leg throbbed, and she looked down at the gaping wound. The blood was still flowing. "Ellie!" Thomas's voice was desperate now. He was swimming toward her. "We're here, we're here." Everything blurred as she lost consciousness. The official record of the attack, filed by the Maritime Police and Environmental Agency, described the incident as a violent and unprovoked attack by a blacktip reef shark, which occurred approximately 300 meters from the shore at the Great Barrier Reef. The victim, Ellie Parker, sustained significant injuries to her leg before being rescued by the research team. Immediate medical treatment was administered, and the victim was airlifted to a nearby hospital for further care. Ellie spent weeks recovering in the hospital, her body slowly healing from the trauma. But even as the physical wounds faded, the psychological scars remained. She couldn't shake the feeling of the shark's jaws closing around her leg, the sheer power of it, the terror, and she knew that no matter how much time passed, the ocean would never feel the same again. Ellie's gaze was fixed on the water's surface as she carefully adjusted her wetsuit. The ripples of the ocean seemed almost hypnotic, beckoning her into its depths. The sound of the small boat's engine sputtered as it anchored a few meters away, bobbing gently in the current. The air was thick with the smell of salt, and the sky stretched out impossibly blue above them. "All right, let's get this show on the road," Professor Hughes called from the boat, his voice a reassuring presence. "Lena, you're with Jackson, making sure the sensors are set up. Ellie, you and Thomas can begin the first round of water sampling. We'll start near that reef and work our way down." Ellie nodded, pulling her mask into place. Her heart raced with excitement. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd dreamed of. The Great Barrier Reef, one of the most spectacular ecosystems on Earth. The creatures, the coral, the patterns that scientists were still trying to fully understand. She could almost feel it calling to her. "Ready?" Thomas asked, his voice muffled through his mask. He was already floating in the water, fins kicking lazily as he waited for Ellie to join him. His camera, strapped securely to his chest, bobbed, slightly in the water. "Yeah, let's go," she replied, giving him a quick thumbs up. Together they swam toward the edge of the reef, the water warm and inviting as it slid past them. The sunlight pierced the surface, casting long shafts of light that illuminated the underwater world below. Ellie felt herself sink into the rhythm of the dive, the soft swoosh of her fins pushing against the current. The reef was just as magnificent. As she had imagined, coral formations in bright reds, yellows, and oranges, with schools of fish darting through the crevices. "Look at this," Thomas murmured, his voice almost reverent as he panned his camera over a cluster of vibrant coral. "This is exactly why we're here, right? To document this beauty." Ellie smiled, nodding in agreement. She glanced back, toward the boat, where Professor Hughes and Lena were getting their equipment ready. The team had a strict protocol to follow for sampling, ensuring they didn't disrupt the ecosystem too much. Ellie and Thomas were responsible for collecting water samples, measuring salinity, temperature, and pH levels at various depths. They moved in tandem, communicating in short gestures, taking care not to disturb the reef. Ellie's gloved hands reached for her collection jar, carefully twisting it open and dipping it into the water. She watched the fluid swirl inside the transparent container, observing the tiny particles floating around it. Everything seemed so alive, so full of energy. She took a moment to breathe it all in, even underwater, as the peacefulness surrounded her. Thomas pointed to a cluster of coral just beyond her reach, signaling that he was going to take some pictures. Ellie glanced toward it, admiring the vibrant array of colors. She glanced back toward the boat. Everything seemed perfect. The team was spread out, working methodically, and the only sound was the faint hum of the ocean and the occasional bubble escaping from her regulator. Then something caught her eye, a shadow. Just a flicker at first, and then it was gone. Ellie's breath caught and she froze for a moment, holding herself still in the water. Thomas was still busy with his camera, completely unaware. Ellie scanned the water, narrowing her eyes. The shadow had been too large to be just a fish. Maybe a manta ray? Or a large school of fish? "Thomas," she signaled, motioning for him to come closer. "Did you see that?" He paused, finally noticing her tense posture. "What?" "A shadow." "Just a second, Argo. Over there." She gestured toward a part of the reef where the water was a little darker. It was big, like maybe a stingray. Thomas squinted, trying to see what she was pointing to. "Could be. We're near the drop-off, so there's a lot of movement in the water here." Ellie nodded, but the unease didn't leave her. She adjusted her mask, trying to shake off the feeling of something lurking just out of sight. It wasn't like her to get spooked. She had swum in places far more dangerous, had been in waters with far more dangerous predators. But there was something about the way the shadow had moved, as though it were following the contours of the reef, moving just beyond their reach. "Let's keep moving," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We're supposed to do this at multiple points anyway." They swam further, deeper into the reef, the vibrant corals and schools of fish becoming more numerous as they descended. Ellie took a deep breath through her regulator, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. The shadow was probably nothing. Just a passing cloud or a large fish, she told herself, but the feeling of unease grew. It wasn't until a few minutes later that she saw it again, a flash of dark grey against the brighter blues and greens. This time Ellie's heart skipped a beat. It was larger than a stingray. The shape was wrong, too fluid, too deliberate. A predator's shape. She signaled to Thomas again, this time more urgently. He looked over and followed her gaze. His eyes widened as he saw what she was pointing at. "That's not a stingray," Thomas said quietly. "That's a shark." Ellie's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. The shark's shape was unmistakable now. Sleek, dark, its dorsal fin cutting through the water like a knife. Ellie's mind raced. "Is it coming towards us?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He was already backing up, signaling for Ellie to do the same. "Stay calm," he whispered, though Ellie could see the fear in his eyes. Slow, steady movements. Ellie tried to slow her breathing, though her pulse was quickening. She backed up toward the reef, her hand brushing against the coral as she turned to swim, but the shark didn't seem to be leaving. It circled around them, its movements fluid and calculated. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. The shark was too close. They were in its territory now. She had read all the textbooks, knew the statistics, knew the behavior of sharks, but in that moment, all of it felt meaningless. "Thomas, we need to get back to the boat," she said, her voice strained. Through the regulator, Thomas didn't argue. He started swimming, slowly at first, but his pace quickened when the shark swam a little closer. Ellie followed, but the reef, once an inviting labyrinth of life, now seemed like an obstacle, a maze that could trap them. The shark wasn't leaving. The water felt thick, heavy, as though the ocean itself was holding them down, dragging them deeper. Ellie's heart was pounding now, and every instinct screamed at her to swim faster, to get away. The shark moved with terrifying grace, circling them again, its eyes unblinking, its presence undeniable. Ellie was close enough to the boat now that she could see Professor Hughes and Lena on the deck, frantically signaling for them to come back. But the distance felt endless. The shark was too close. "Ellie, get moving!" Thomas yelled, his voice high-pitched, his eyes wide with panic. Without thinking, Ellie kicked harder, pushing herself toward the boat, but it was too late. The shark darted forward with lightning speed, its body a blur, and before she could react, it struck. Ellie didn't know what happened after that, only that the pain was excruciating. A sharp, tearing force had clamped down on her leg, dragging her underwater. She felt the pressure of the shark's jaws, the sickening sensation of teeth sinking into flesh. A scream, muffled through her regulator, erupted from her throat. Ellie's heart beat faster as she submerged, the cool water swallowing her whole. She felt a brief moment of disorientation, but it quickly passed as the clarity of the reef below came into focus. The coral formations stretched out like alien cities, their vibrant hues of orange, pink, and purple contrasting against the sand and shifting water. Schools of small fish darted in and out of crevices, while larger fish cruised in slow, deliberate motions. The silence was profound, only the faint sound of her breathing through the regulator and the occasional whisper of the current passing by. She glanced at Thomas, who was already adjusting his camera to capture the underwater landscape. He signaled her to move forward, and they began swimming in tandem, careful to avoid disturbing the delicate corals beneath them. Ellie's hand hovered over the ground as she reached for the first water sample container, a clear, small bottle attached to her waist. She unscrewed the lid and dipped the bottle into the water, the current tugging at her. It was a simple task, but one she had done countless times during her studies. She glanced up at Thomas, who gave her a nod, and gestured to a formation of coral to her right. She adjusted her fins and swam towards it. It was a particularly large colony of brain coral. Its intricate maze-like structure seemed almost unreal in its complexity. Ellie extended her arm to get a closer look, her hand reaching out just above the reef. Then it happened. A movement in the water, too swift, too sudden. Ellie didn't see it at first, only felt a sudden pressure against her body. Her heart skipped. A beat as she turned just in time to see a dark shadow cutting through the water, its silhouette unmistakable. A shark! "Thomas!" she tried to shout, but the sound was lost in the muffled depths. She froze. The shark was coming straight for her, its sleek torpedo-like body cutting through the water with terrifying speed. Her eyes widened in shock as the predator's movements became more aggressive, its mouth opening slightly as it closed the distance between them. Thomas was still several meters away, seemingly unaware of the danger. Ellie's mind raced. She needed to move, but everything felt wrong. Her body locked in a mix of terror and instinct, her breathing shallow through the regulator. The shark wasn't making the classic slow approach. This one was aggressive, immediate, and intent on something. The shark's dorsal fin sliced the water unmistakable. It was large, much larger than a reef shark should be for this area, a featureless black form of muscle and hunger. She could feel the vibrations of its movement in the water, each thrum sending a wave of dread through her chest. Ellie tried to push herself backward, instinctively kicking with her fins, but it was too late. The shark was almost on her now. Suddenly, her arm was grabbed, yanked hard. She gasped in pain, but it wasn't the shark, it was Thomas. His hand gripped her tightly, pulling her away from the coral as the shark closed in. But even in the chaos, Ellie saw something that struck her. The shark wasn't interested in the coral, it was coming straight for her. She kicked harder, desperate to get away, but it was too fast. With a force that seemed to shake the water, around her the shark lunged. Its jaws snapped, teeth flashing like knives in the clear water. Ellie barely had time to react before the shark's body collided with hers, the impact sending shockwaves through her whole body. The pain was immediate, an agonizing sharp bite to her left leg right above the knee. She could feel the searing pressure, the hot, raw force of the shark's teeth sinking deep into her flesh. Ellie screamed, though the sound was muffled beneath the water. Her vision blurred as she felt herself being dragged, her body jerked violently in the water. Blood clouded the space around her, a dark, spreading stain. The shark wasn't letting go. "Ellie!" Thomas screamed, his voice finally breaking through the chaos as he pulled her again, desperately trying to drag her away from the shark. He kicked hard, his legs working in frantic strokes. Ellie could see his face, pale with panic, his eyes wide, unable to comprehend what was happening. But the shark wasn't done. It snapped again, its jaws closing around her other leg this time, pulling her under. Ellie gasped, a sharp intake of breath through her regulator, but it felt like the ocean was closing in on her. The weight of the creature, its unrelenting power seemed to fill her every sense. She could no longer think, no longer act, only survive. "Hold on!" Thomas yelled, his voice cracking. With one final, desperate yank, he managed to free Ellie from the shark's grip, dragging her backward, through the water. Her legs burned from the pain, the blood staining the water around them. She was disoriented, her mind foggy from the shock, but the terror of the shark's attack was like a vice squeezing her chest. "Thomas, keep moving, keep moving," Ellie managed to croak, though her voice was barely a whisper. Her heart was pounding in her ears, every part of her body shaking with fear and pain. But the worst part, the part that would stay with her long after, was the terrifying sensation that the shark wasn't done. It circled beneath them, the water suddenly seeming colder, darker, more oppressive. "Get to the surface, now!" Thomas yelled, his hand firmly gripping Ellie's arm, pulling her toward the boat. Ellie tried to kick, but her leg felt like it was made of lead, the pain in her body overwhelming her ability to focus. But her survival instincts kicked in, and she began to swim, each stroke weaker than the last. It felt like an eternity, but finally the boat came into view, its outlines growing larger. Ellie's vision began to swim as she felt herself sinking, her energy completely drained. But Thomas's grip never wavered. He pulled her up the side of the boat, shouting for help as the others scrambled to assist. As she was lifted onto the deck, her leg left a trail of blood in the water, marking her passage. Lena was the first to reach her, her face grim with recognition. "Ellie! Oh God, Ellie!" she murmured, her hands already at Ellie's leg, trying to assess the damage. "Professor." Hughes was shouting into the radio for the Coast Guard. The sound was a blur to Ellie, her head spinning, her body already succumbing to the shock. All she could do was watch the water, her heart still racing, her body racked with pain. The boat began to pull away from the reef, the adrenaline slowly beginning to ebb. And then, just as suddenly as the shark had appeared, it was gone. The water was eerily still. The blood from her wounds swirled and dissipated in the water, as if the shark had never been there at all. But Ellie knew better. Ellie's mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. One moment she was reaching for the coral. The next, a violent force slammed into her side, throwing her off balance. For a split second, all she could feel was the cold sting of water rushing into her mouth as she flailed instinctively. Her mask, now half filled with seawater, distorted her vision, and she kicked hard, desperate to regain control. But the pressure was relentless. Something powerful had gripped her, something far too strong to be a passing fish or even a large stingray. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she twisted and kicked again, trying to break free. Her body was jerked downward, and her legs scraped against the rough coral beneath her, tearing her wetsuit. She could feel the water turning from calm to turbulent, the current swirling as if responding to an unseen force. Through the distorted view of her mask, she saw it, a large grey form in the water, its body sleek, its fins cutting through the water with terrifying precision. The shark was massive, easily longer than she was tall, its dorsal fins slicing through the water just a few feet away. "Thomas!" She tried to yell, but the words came out as muffled bubbles. Her head spun and her breathing was becoming ragged. Panic surged through her veins like electricity. She had heard about the sharks that roamed the reefs of the Great Barrier, but this was different. This wasn't just a harmless visitor. This was a predator, and it had her in its sights. She kicked harder, trying to distance herself from the beast, but her body was already bruised, her movements sluggish with fear. The shark, a black-tip reef shark, circled her in smooth, calculated motions. Its eyes, cold, predatory, never left her. Ellie's mind was racing, but her body felt heavy. She reached for her knife strapped to her leg, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the sheath. She knew it was futile. A knife wouldn't stop something this size. Her only hope now was to get back to the boat, back to safety. "Thomas," she tried again, her voice barely a whisper, but the noise of the water and her panicked breaths drowned it out. Her gaze darted to Thomas, who was still too far away. His back turned to her as he focused on his camera, oblivious to the danger. Ellie's chest tightened. She had no time to warn him. Her only chance was to make it back to the boat. The shark struck again, this time catching her leg in its powerful jaws. Ellie screamed as pain shot through her body. The teeth sunk deep into her thigh, the weight of the shark's bite dragging her down. She could feel the blood pouring into the water, a warm red current that sent her heart into overdrive. "Get off me!" she screamed, kicking frantically, her hands scrambling for anything to hold on to. The shark's grip was unyielding. With a brutal shake of its head, the shark tossed her like a rag doll, sending her spinning through the water. The world around her was a whirlpool of bubbles and distortion. Her mask had been knocked loose, and her eyes stung as seawater flooded her face. Ellie gasped, sucking in air through her regulator, but it was hard to keep calm. The pain in her leg was sharp, excruciating, and the disorientation made everything seem like a nightmare. She reached for her leg, trying to stop the bleeding, but the water was darkening too quickly, turning crimson around her. Her movements were slow, heavy, as though she were moving through molasses. Her body was in shock. She had to get to the surface. She had to. The shark came at her again, its body slicing through the water with incredible speed. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as it charged, its teeth bared, eyes locked on her in a terrifying gaze. It was coming for another bite. Desperation surged through her. Ellie kicked, her legs burning from the effort, her body screaming with fatigue. She could feel the pull of the deep, the overwhelming force of the ocean trying to drag her under, but she fought it with every ounce of her being. "Thomas, please," she managed to gasp, but the words were lost in the tumult of the water. Just as the shark lunged again, there was a sudden flash of movement. "Thomas, Ellie!" His voice broke through the fog of her fear, but it was too late. The shark was on her. Thomas surged forward, his face pale, eyes wide in horror. He reached out, grasping for her, but the shark was faster. It snapped at Ellie's arm, tearing her wetsuit and grazing her flesh. Pain shot through her like fire, and she screamed. Thomas reached her just as the shark retreated, its sleek body cutting through the water with deadly grace. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his hands firm, but his eyes were filled with panic. "Ellie, Ellie, we need to get you out of here now," he shouted, his voice barely audible through the regulator. But Ellie couldn't move. The blood loss, the shock, the pain, it was too much. She felt herself going limp in his grip, her head spinning as the cold, dark water pressed in from all sides. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice weak, barely a breath. It's too late. No, stay with me, Ellie." His voice was a desperate plea. He tugged at her, trying to pull her toward the surface. The shark had disappeared into the depths, but Ellie knew it wasn't gone. It would be back. They were still in its territory. Thomas kicked with powerful strokes, his face a mask of determination. He didn't look back at the water, didn't stop to check for the shark. He only focused on getting Ellie to safety. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he fought the water, each stroke dragging them both closer to the boat. Ellie's vision blurred, her breathing shallow. She tried to speak again, but her words were nothing more than bubbles escaping through the regulator. With one final desperate push, Thomas broke the surface, gasping for air, hauling Ellie's limp form behind him. The boat loomed ahead, and the crew on board were shouting, frantic, but the world around Ellie seemed distant, muffled, as if she were hearing everything underwater. "Help!" Thomas shouted, his voice raw. "We need help! Now!" Hands reached out from the boat, pulling Ellie aboard. The warmth of the deck against her back felt surreal, distant. Her mind was fading. As the boat pulled away from the reef, she felt a brief, fleeting sense of relief. The shark was gone. But Ellie knew, even in her haze, that the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Ellie's body screamed with exhaustion as she fought against the relentless pull of the water. The shark was close, closer than she'd ever imagined anything could be. Its sleek, silvery body sliced through the current with unnatural speed. She could feel its presence, the weight of it, as though the ocean itself had turned against her. Her legs ached from kicking, from trying to escape, but the shark was faster. It circled her once, twice, its body cutting through the water with a terrifying ease. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She knew the shark was sizing her up, watching, calculating. Her breath came in ragged bursts through her regulator, but the water pressure felt like a vice against her chest, making each inhalation harder, more desperate. Through the clouded water, she saw the shadow of Thomas, a silhouette against the bright backdrop of the reef. He was still several meters away, working to adjust his camera, completely unaware of the danger that lurked just beyond the visibility of his lens. "Thomas!" Ellie tried again, but the word was lost in the current, swallowed up by the roaring sound in her ears. The mask, now completely fogged up, distorted her vision, and she tugged at it frantically, trying to clear it. The moment she did, the image of the shark grew clearer. The dark eyes locked onto hers. Her chest tightened. It was coming for her. Her body surged upward on instinct, desperate for air, but the shark was faster, more precise. It darted forward, its mouth wide, the rows of teeth sharp and white against the murky water. Ellie's heart seized as the shark struck, its teeth sinking into her calf with brutal force. The pain was immediate, a searing, fiery agony that shot through her leg. The pressure of the bite was intense, unforgiving. Her blood, hot and thick, mingled with the salt water as it poured into the ocean. Ellie screamed through her regulator, but it was swallowed by the vast expanse of the ocean. Her leg was trapped, caught in the shark's powerful grip. Panic surged through her body and she kicked, throwing everything she had into escaping. The shark didn't relent. It held on, its teeth grinding deeper into her flesh. The world around her spun. For a moment, all Ellie could feel was the burning pain in her leg, the suffocating tightness in her chest as the regulator slipped from her mouth. Her vision blurred, darkening at the edges, as the water around her grew darker with her own blood. She reached down in a panic, grabbing at the regulator and forcing it back into her mouth. But her body was losing strength, and the taste of copper filled her mouth. "Thomas," she tried again, her voice raw, her throat tight. The pain was too much, but she couldn't give up. She couldn't let this be the end. Through the haze of blood and the fog in her mask, she saw him. Thomas had finally noticed. His eyes went wide as he saw the shark latched onto her leg. His body jerked into motion, but he was too far away. Too slow. Ellie's breathing was erratic, her movements sluggish. She reached for her leg, her fingers brushing against the shark's gills. It was massive, too massive for her to fight off. Desperation took over, and she swung her other leg, kicking with all the force she could muster, aiming for the shark's side. It was no use. The shark didn't budge. It was relentless, its grip unyielding. "Ellie, hold on!" Thomas shouted, his voice muffled but urgent. He was close now, too close for comfort. Ellie wanted to reach out to help him, but her body was failing her. She felt cold creeping into her limbs, numbing them with shock. The shark shifted, its jaws retracting. Slightly, but only to get a better angle. Ellie's vision blurred again, the edges of the water darkening as the world tilted around her. A gut-wrenching sob racked her body, but she couldn't make a sound. Her mouth was full of salt water, her body unresponsive. She fought the pull of unconsciousness, knowing that if she gave in, she was as good as dead. "Ellie." Thomas's voice rang through the water like a bell, sharp and clear. Ellie felt the strong tug of his hand as he reached for her. She grabbed onto him as best she could, her grip weak but desperate. He wasn't giving up, not for a second. "Don't let go, Ellie. Don't you dare let go." Thomas's words were firm, insistent. She nodded weakly, but the pain in her leg was unbearable. The shark was pulling again, dragging her deeper, but this time Thomas wasn't backing off. He fought against the pull of the predator, wrapping his arms around her as best he could, trying to keep her upright. The shark retreated, just as quickly as it had attacked, its body disappearing into the murkiness of the water as if it had never been there. Ellie's head spun as she clung to Thomas, too weak to do anything but hold on. "Come on, Ellie, we've got to get you to the surface," Thomas grunted, pulling her closer as he kicked hard, aiming to ascend. But Ellie's body wasn't cooperating. The pain from her leg was unbearable, and she could feel her strength draining, her limbs growing heavier with each passing second. Her head was light, and the only thing she could focus on was the distant shape of the boat, the glimmering surface above them, the faintest glimmer of hope. "Almost there," Thomas murmured. "I've got you." Ellie's fingers were slick, but she couldn't let go. She forced herself to keep swimming, to keep moving, but the world around her was narrowing. She felt herself slipping away, drowning in both the physical pain and the helplessness that flooded her mind. "Ellie!" Thomas shouted again, pulling her closer, but Ellie didn't answer. The surface loomed overhead. The sunlight seemed like a distant dream, but it was there, faint, beckoning her. She was almost there, almost. The cold ocean water wrapped around her, but it was nothing compared to the coldness creeping into her limbs. With one final surge of willpower, Thomas pushed them both upward, breaking through the surface with a rush of air. Ellie gasped, her lungs screaming as she sucked in a desperate breath. Her face broke through the water, and she choked, spitting out seawater, trying to regain some semblance of control. But all she could feel was the pain in her leg, the sharp, brutal reminder that the shark's teeth had left their mark. The boat loomed closer, and soon Ellie could hear the frantic shouts of Professor Hughes and Jackson. "Get her in the boat!" Hughes yelled, his voice panicked, strained. Thomas moved quickly, one arm around Ellie's torso, supporting her as they swam the short distance to the boat. Jackson leaned over the edge, reaching for them, his face pale. "Hold on, Ellie! We've got you!" Jackson's voice was frantic as he and Thomas pulled her in, one at a time, with desperate hands. Ellie collapsed onto the deck, her leg burning with pain. Her body shook, either from shock or fear, she didn't know anymore. Professor Hughes was already on his radio, barking orders to the local authorities for immediate assistance. But Ellie couldn't hear him anymore. The world was slipping away. As her consciousness drifted in and out, the pain, the terror, the memory of those eyes, those dark, merciless eyes, still haunting her. Ellie's body jerked violently as the shark struck. The pain exploded through her leg, a searing, jagged agony that made her vision swim. She screamed, though the sound was swallowed by her regulator. The force of the attack sent her spiraling backward into the water, her body flailing as she tried to maintain control. Blood, dark and thick, swirled around her in the water, mixing with the ocean's salt. Her heart beat wildly, and for a moment everything seemed distant, muffled. She could feel the wetness spreading around her. Much of it too quickly, but her thoughts scrambled, unable to make sense of the situation. She tried to kick, to move, to escape, but her leg was on fire. Her mind struggled to focus. The shark was still there, its sleek body cutting through the water, the black eyes gleaming with an almost unnatural awareness. The blood. She had to stop the bleeding. Ellie reached down, instinctively pressing her hand to the gash in her thigh. Her gloved fingers slipped against the slick, warm blood, but the pressure did nothing to slow the torrent. Panic clawed at her insides as she thought about the way the shark had bitten. Quick, precise, relentless. It had torn through her suit like it was paper. She looked up. Thomas was finally turning toward her, his face a mask of confusion. His eyes widened as he saw the blood in the water, and his body froze for just a moment before he began swimming toward her. "Ellie!" he shouted, his voice barely audible beneath the surface. Ellie tried to reach out, but her arms felt weak. Her body was shaking from shock, her vision dimming at the edges as the pain in her leg radiated up through her torso. She couldn't stay afloat much longer. The shark was circling, its dark form gliding closer. It was watching, waiting. Ellie knew what it was doing. She had read the papers, listened to the warnings. Sharks weren't mindless killers, but hunters. It wasn't just the blood that attracted it. It was the distress, the vulnerability, the injured prey that triggered a predator's instinct. Her mind screamed at her to move, to get out of the water, to survive. But she couldn't. She was too weak, too slow. Ellie. Thomas was closer now, his hand reaching for her. But as he approached, the shark darted again, cutting the water with a flash of its teeth. Thomas froze mid-motion, his eyes locked on the predator. Ellie felt a sickening jolt of terror. The shark was too close to him now. "Get back!" Ellie tried to shout, but her voice was lost, swallowed by the roaring tide of her own panic. The shark was coming for Thomas. Thomas didn't move. His hand still hovered in the water, but his focus was completely on the shark, his face pale beneath his mask. He was terrified, but there was something else in his eyes, something Ellie couldn't quite place. It wasn't just fear. It was something primal, instinctual. Ellie kicked with all her remaining strength, trying to push herself closer to Thomas. She knew she needed to protect him, needed to warn him, but her leg was useless. She could barely keep herself afloat. "Thomas, move!" she finally managed, the words bubbling out through the regulator. In a blur of motion, Thomas turned to her, a fleeting moment of recognition crossing his face. He swam toward her, but before he could reach her, the shark lunged. It happened so fast that Ellie barely had time to process it. One moment, Thomas was swimming toward her, and the next the water erupted in a flash of white, and the shark was on him. Its massive jaws opened, the sharp teeth gleaming in the sunlight as it clamped down on his leg. Thomas screamed, his body jerking violently as the shark twisted, dragging him under the water. Ellie's mind went blank. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Everything became a blur of red and motion. Her body froze, and for one agonizing moment she couldn't move, couldn't reach out. The shark let go of Thomas's leg, and Ellie watched in horror as he shot up to the surface, his face contorted in pain. Blood streamed from his leg, a trail of crimson in the water. The shark, undeterred, circled once more, its eyes locked on its next prey. "No!" Ellie screamed, forcing her body to move. She kicked harder than she thought she could, fighting. Through the pain in her leg, she had to get to Thomas. She had to pull him out of the water. "Ellie!" Thomas gasped, his voice barely audible. His eyes were wide with fear and shock. "Get out, it's—" Before he could finish, the shark struck again. This time it came from below, its body a blur of muscle and speed as it rammed into Thomas, knocking him down. Ellie could see the gaping wound on his leg, the blood bubbling up in waves. He was weakening, slipping further away from her reach. Ellie's heart clenched. She could feel the shark's predatory gaze on her, feel it in her bones. She had no choice now. She couldn't let it take Thomas, couldn't let it finish what it had started. "Get to the surface," Ellie screamed, her voice breaking. Thomas was still disoriented, struggling to stay afloat. His body was covered in blood, his movements slow, pained. The shark was circling again, growing bolder with each pass. Ellie looked up. Above the surface of the water, she could just make out the faint shape of the boat, the outlines of Jackson and Lena standing at the edge, unaware of the full scope of the danger below. "Help!" Ellie screamed, kicking again, pushing herself toward the surface with everything she had left. She could feel her strength waning, could feel the blood flowing from her leg, dragging her down. She reached Thomas, grabbing his arm with a strength she didn't know she had. Her fingers dug into his suit as she yanked him upward, pulling him toward the surface. But the shark was faster. It was already circling, its eyes glinting with predatory malice. The surface seemed too far. A sudden, violent splash erupted next to her. The shark had turned, its massive body surging toward them. The water turned black with its shadow. "No!" Ellie screamed, her voice raw and desperate. Ellie's world narrowed into a blur of pain and water. The sharp bite of the shark's teeth was a constant pulse in her leg, each throb sending waves of agony that made her stomach churn. Her body was drifting, pulled by the current, her movements sluggish as blood spread in all directions. It felt like an eternity, but she knew it had only been seconds. She had to fight to stay conscious. She had to move. Thomas's silhouette was getting closer, his arms thrashing through the water in frantic strokes. The blood in the water was like a beacon, calling the predator back, and she could feel the shark circling again. Ellie, hang. Hon, I'm coming, hold on. Thomas's voice cut through the water, strained and urgent. Her breaths were ragged now. Each inhale through her regulator felt like it was tearing her chest apart. She tried to focus, to do something, anything, to stop the bleeding, but her limbs were heavy and uncooperative. The gash in her thigh was deep, and she could feel the warmth of the blood turning colder. The shark darted closer again, its body a quick blur of grey and white. Ellie's breath hitched, and she instinctively pushed herself up toward the surface, her hands reaching out toward the fading light above. She had to get to the boat. She had to make it. The water seemed to press down on her, its weight pulling her back. No, no, no. Her thoughts fractured as she kicked again, harder this time, forcing her body toward the surface. "Ellie!" Thomas shouted again, panic now evident in his voice. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm and pulling her closer. He was trying to drag her to the surface, but the weight of her leg, the damage to it, slowed them both. For a moment, the shark was gone. Ellie dared to hope, but then she felt it, a shadow underneath her moving with terrifying speed. Her heart dropped, and she twisted in the water, eyes wide with dread as she saw the dark silhouette approaching. "Once more!" "No!" Ellie cried, but it came out as nothing more than a strangled gasp. Her body was on fire from the pain, and now there was a new, visceral fear rising within her, raw, primal, like a cold hand gripping her chest. The shark surged. From below, its mouth open in a wide, terrifying arc. Ellie's mind barely had time to register the movement before it was upon her. She kicked hard, flailing, but it was too late. The shark slammed into her again, this time its teeth sinking into the flesh of her side, just below her ribs. Thomas screamed as Ellie went completely limp, her body unable to fight back any longer. The predator's jaws clamped down, a brutal, crushing force that sent a shock of electric pain through her chest. She felt the world begin to dim, the water turning from blue to dark red as the blood poured from her wounds. Her legs stopped moving, and the world went still. And then, just as quickly as the shark had struck, it released her. The water seemed to still for a heartbeat. The shark hovered just beyond reach, its beady black eyes locked onto Ellie, studying her with an almost detached calmness. For a brief, horrifying second, Ellie felt like she was looking into the depths of the ocean itself. The shark's dorsal fin sliced through the water, its sleek body gliding back into the shadows of the reef, as if deciding she was no longer worth the effort. "Ellie!" Thomas shouted, his voice breaking through her haze of pain and fear. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her upward with a strength she hadn't known he had. But it wasn't enough. The world above, the surface, felt impossibly far away. Ellie's vision blurred, and she could taste the salt water in her mouth, thick and bitter. She could feel her body growing cold, her limbs heavy as lead. Her lungs burned, fighting for air, but she could barely hold on to consciousness. "Ellie, no, you're not dying on me." Thomas was yelling now, his voice shaking as he dragged her toward the surface. His hand was on her back, guiding her. As they ascended, his other hand struggling to adjust his own regulator so that he could breathe as he pulled her. Everything felt slow, so painfully slow. The water, the movement, the oxygen, everything was moving through thick, syrupy moments. Ellie could barely focus, her vision fading in and out. The pain was too much. She could barely feel her leg now, numb from shock, but the rest of her body felt like it was on fire, like the ocean itself was burning her from the inside out. Above her, she saw the flicker of light through the water, distant, unreachable. But Thomas wasn't stopping. His hand was gripping her tighter, pulling her up faster. "Hold on, Ellie, hold on," he urged, his voice desperate, a tremor in every syllable. Ellie could feel herself slipping. She couldn't breathe properly. The pressure in her chest was unbearable. The blood was clouding her vision. But then, finally, her head broke the surface of the water. Cool, fresh air slammed into her lungs. She gasped, shallow, painful breaths filling her chest, the oxygen burning as she drew it in. The boat was there not far, the figures of Jackson and Lena above her, both of them shouting frantically. "Help! We need help!" Thomas screamed, but his voice was barely audible through the rush of water in Ellie's ears. She felt her body being lifted out of the water, but everything was a haze. The boat's edge loomed over her, and she could hear the frantic scrambling of Jackson and Lena. They were pulling her in, but she couldn't move, couldn't help them. Her body was too heavy, too broken. "Ellie, stay with me," Thomas said, his voice close now, shaking her out of her stupor. His hand was on her shoulder, his grip tight, and she could feel his pulse under her fingertips. "Stay with me, Ellie. You're gonna be okay. Please, stay with me." The sound of the boat engine roared to life, but Ellie could barely focus. On it, the blood on her skin, the cold in her limbs, the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. It was too much to process. Everything was moving too fast, too erratically. Her body, already teetering on the edge, began to fail her in a way she couldn't control. I can't," she whispered through cracked lips, her voice barely there. But the world around her was already fading once more. Ellie's heart hammered in her chest as her body rose slowly toward the surface, her limbs heavy and clumsy, each kick sending waves of pain radiating from her leg. The pressure of the water felt like it was crushing her chest with every desperate breath, but she fought through it. The blood clouding the water was growing thicker, spreading farther from her like an ominous red halo. The shark was close. She could feel it circling beneath her, moving with the kind of predatory patience that made her stomach turn. "Come on, Ellie. Just a little more." Thomas's voice was close now, his figure visible above her as the surface of the water became clearer with each second. She could see the outline of the boat beyond him. Too far, but still within reach if she could just make it. Her body felt numb, like it wasn't her own anymore. The pain in her leg was unbearable, and yet her instincts, pure survival instinct, drove her forward. She reached the surface with a gasp, her head breaking through the water just as the shark's shadow disappeared below. Her eyes scanned the boat, her vision clouded with dizziness. The boat wasn't far, she could make it, she had to. "Ellie, you're okay, I've got you." Thomas's voice was frantic now, his hand reaching down, fingers brushing her arm. He was close enough to grab, but not close enough to pull her in. The shark was still out there, somewhere just beneath the surface, waiting. Ellie's chest felt tight, her breathing shallow as she tried to focus. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "Thomas," she gasped, her voice a hoarse rasp. "The shark. It's not leaving." "I know," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at her. His eyes were scanning the water, searching for any sign of movement, any sign of the predator lurking beneath. "But we need to move, Ellie. We need to get you out of here. Now." Ellie felt herself start to drift again. The world around her felt like it was spinning, the edges of her vision dimming as the blood loss took its toll. She could feel her body weakening, her limbs growing heavy, her head swimming with vertigo. Panic surged again, and she grabbed Thomas's arm with what little strength she had left. No, I can't." "You can," Thomas said firmly, grabbing her hand and pulling it to his chest. "You have to. I'm here, Ellie. Just hold on. Please hold on." She could feel his words, like a lifeline thrown into the ocean. He wasn't leaving her. He wouldn't leave her. He pulled her closer, positioning her body so she could float more easily in the water. His hands moved quickly, adjusting her buoyancy, making sure she was stable, but Ellie couldn't help the tremor that ran through her. The shark was still out there, she could sense it. It was close, maybe only yards away. It was waiting for a chance, any chance, to strike again. Her mind reeled. She tried to focus on Thomas, on his hand holding hers, but the world around her was fading. She could hear his voice, his calm reassurances, but it was as if it was coming from a great distance. She could see the boat now, only a few feet away, but it felt like it was miles. She could hardly keep her eyes open. "Ellie," Thomas's voice was sharp now, urgent. He tugged her, trying to get her to move toward the boat. But her body felt like lead and she couldn't make it. The water around her rippled again. Ellie's heart stopped as she felt the unmistakable pressure of something moving beneath her. Her pulse spiked. She tried to push herself forward, but her leg throbbed with every movement. The shark was back. It shot toward her with a speed she couldn't have anticipated. Her vision blurred as its form flashed before her eyes, its sharp teeth glinting beneath the water's surface. The roar of the ocean seemed to rise around her, drowning out everything else. Thomas didn't have time to react. He was still holding her, trying to drag her toward the boat. But the shark was there too fast. It struck with a sudden bone-jarring force, its body slamming into Ellie's already wounded leg. The pain was blinding, and Ellie screamed, but the sound was muffled by the water. Thomas let out a strangled cry, but his hands were now locked around her waist, his grip tight as he pulled her desperately toward the boat. The shark recoiled, circling again, watching. "Help!" Thomas shouted, his voice full of desperation. His eyes locked onto the boat where Lena and Jackson were frantically trying to haul the small rescue raft closer. "Lena! Jackson! Get the raft! Hurry!" Ellie's leg felt like it was on fire, the sharp, tearing pain almost unbearable. Blood continued to cloud the water, and she could feel the weight of the shark's gaze following her every move. It was waiting for another opportunity, another strike. "Come on, Ellie, just a little more." Thomas's voice was a lifeline, pulling her from the edge of the abyss. He gritted his teeth, his hands pulling her forward with the strength of someone who refused to let go, refused to let her slip into the dark depths of the ocean. Ellie's vision was narrowing again. She could feel her breath growing weaker, more labored. The boat was closer, but still, the shark was circling, and the blood in the water wasn't helping. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to reach out for the boat, but her hands felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. The taste of salt water and iron filled her mouth, mixing with the bitter taste of panic. But then she felt it. Thomas's hand, strong and steady, grabbing hers once more, pulling her toward safety. The boat's hull was just within reach now. Her fingers brushed against it, and for a moment she thought she couldn't go any further. She thought she might collapse right there. But Thomas's voice surged through her again like an electric shock. "Ellie, don't you dare give up now. You're almost there. Almost there. Just keep going." She gathered every last bit of strength in her battered body and pushed, feeling the boat's rough side beneath her fingertips. Her chest heaved with effort, each breath ragged and shallow. But then finally, she felt the arms of Jackson and Lena pulling her up, their hands strong around her, lifting her from the water's grip. She was safe, but she didn't know if she could believe it yet. Her eyes closed, and she let herself go limp in their arms, the boat rocking gently beneath her. The shark had disappeared back into the depths, but the memories of its strike would remain, burned into her mind like the ocean's endless pulse. Ellie's head throbbed. The pounding inside her skull was relentless, a constant reminder of how far from safety she still was. Her body felt like it was sinking into the ocean, dragging her under with every slow movement, as though the sea itself was intent on keeping her. But she couldn't let it win. She couldn't die here, not like this, not after everything. Her vision wavered, darkening at the edges. Her leg burned like it was on fire, and every breath felt more desperate than the last, like the ocean was, tightening around her chest with invisible hands. The surface of the water above her was too far, and yet she was still pushing, swimming, clawing at the water in an attempt to make the distance. To escape. "Ellie!" Thomas's voice was closer now, but it was still too far, too far. His hand brushed her shoulder again, but it wasn't enough. The shark was there. She could feel it, the pressure of the water shifting with each pass it made beneath her. She had heard that black-tip reef sharks weren't usually dangerous. They were known for being more curious than aggressive. But this one had tasted blood, and now it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. Thomas grabbed her arm, pulling with all his strength, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he fought to pull her higher into the water, toward the boat. "Ellie, come on!" His voice cracked, breaking through the water's surface with desperation. I've got you. But as soon as he pulled her upward, she felt the tug, the shift in the water, as something massive surged below them. The shark. It was coming. Ellie's body went rigid with terror, but there was no more strength in her to fight it. All she could do was hold on to Thomas, her fingers slipping against his wetsuit as she gasped for air. "Thomas," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. The pain in her leg was unbearable. Blood was still flowing freely, thick and dark, swirling with the ocean around her. It felt like the water was alive, hungry. "I can't pull you up, Ellie. You've got to help me," Thomas shouted, his grip tightening on her arm, but Ellie's fingers were slipping, her own strength evaporating with each passing second. Her head was spinning. The world was turning black again. "No, Ellie gasped, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "The shark!" "I know," Thomas said, his voice low but urgent. "It's okay. It's okay. We're gonna get out of here." I'm not letting go, but Ellie could feel the water shifting again, the unmistakable brush of something large moving beneath her. The shark was back, and this time it was moving in for the kill. Her heart leapt into her throat as she looked down into the depths, the murky water swirling with her blood. The blood. She was losing too much. It came at her faster than she could react, faster than Thomas could even see. The shark shot upward, its mouth open, its body a blur of muscle and hunger. Ellie screamed, but the sound was lost beneath the roar of the water and the scream of her own mind. Everything happened in a blur. The shark lunged at her leg. Her body was pulled downward with a force that felt like it was tearing her apart. For a second, she thought she was going to be swallowed whole, dragged into the darkness of the ocean. But then, just as quickly, it released her. The shark's mouth snapped shut with a terrifying crack, but Ellie was no longer in its grasp. "Ellie?" Thomas's voice cut through the chaos, his hands pulling her upward again, the boat just inches away. She felt his grip lock around her shoulders, but it was like he was pulling her through quicksand, like the water was trying to pull them both under. She kicked, weakly at first, her body too tired to do much more than flounder. But then the adrenaline kicked in. She had to make it. She had to survive. She could feel the boat below them, and with every ounce of strength she had left, she pushed. Her body upward, forcing her legs to work, forcing her hands to reach for the sides. "I got you. I got you," Thomas shouted again, his voice strained. Just a little more." Ellie's vision was flickering, darkness at the edges of her sight, but the boat was there. It was close enough now that she could almost feel the hull beneath her fingers. "Just a few more seconds. Come on, Ellie, come on." Thomas's voice was breaking now, a mixture of panic and relief. He pulled again, using every last bit of strength in his body. But Ellie could feel herself slipping. She could feel the coldness creeping over her, her body growing weaker by the second, the blood loss more than she could handle. And then, the shark struck again. A sudden impact, a violent tug, like a freight train slamming into her body. Water churned as the beast lunged at her again, its jaws snapping with terrifying precision. Ellie cried out, her hands slipping from the boat, the force of the shark's attack throwing her backward. But Thomas was there. Thomas was always there. Without thinking, he lunged forward, grabbing her just before she slipped back into the depths. His arms locked around her chest, and with a force that defied his exhaustion, he yanked her up into the boat, pulling her clear of the water and onto the hull. The shark lingered just below the surface, its dark eyes watching them from the depths. Ellie was gasping for air now, her body heaving as she collapsed onto the boat. Her leg was on fire. Every breath was a struggle. Blood was pouring from the deep gash in her thigh, staining the water around them. Thomas climbed in after her, his hands shaking as he reached for the emergency kit. "Hold on, Ellie," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible but full of urgency. "You're gonna be okay, I've got you." Ellie's vision was slipping again. She tried to focus, but the world around her was spinning. The ocean was still beneath them, still vast and unfeeling. The shark had disappeared back into the depths, but Ellie knew it wasn't gone. It was still out there, waiting, just like she had been. "Thomas," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "The shark—" "I know," Thomas said softly, his voice tight with fear. "It's gone for now, we're okay." But Ellie wasn't sure she believed him. She wasn't sure she could ever believe that anything was okay again. Her body trembled uncontrollably as Thomas worked quickly, applying pressure to her leg to stop the bleeding. The pain was a distant echo now, dulled by the shock, the blood loss, the terror that still gripped her chest. In the distance, she could hear the boat's motor starting, the low hum of the engine cutting through the water. The horizon ahead was blurred, too far to reach, too far to matter. All she knew was that she was still alive. But for how long? The world felt like it was slipping away from Ellie, the edges of her consciousness fraying like the fibers of an old rope. Her body was nothing but a heavy, aching mass of pain, and each movement took more out of her than she could afford to give. But somewhere, just beneath the surface of that dull, pressing sensation, she heard Thomas, his voice cutting through the haze like a lifeline. Ellie, stay with me. His voice, urgent and raw, anchored her, as if it were the only thing holding her to reality. Just a little longer, please. You have to fight. She opened her eyes, struggling to focus on him. His face was pale, panic written in every line of his expression. He was treading water, his hand gripping her arm with a strength she didn't know he had, pulling her toward the boat, towards safety. But Ellie couldn't feel her legs anymore. The blood that had poured from the gash in her thigh seemed to have drained away all sensation, leaving her in a muted world of half-consciousness. She tried to kick, to help him pull her up, but it was like her body was a stranger, refusing to cooperate. She gasped for air, coughing up seawater, each sputtering breath a struggle. The salt stung in her lungs, and her eyes burned as the weight of exhaustion dragged her back down. Her grip on reality slipped again, but the constant thrum of Thomas's voice, desperate and filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place, was the only thing keeping her from falling into the black void. Stay. Awake, Ellie. Stay with me. The boat's right there. Just a little further. Please, please, Ellie. It was all she could do to nod weakly, her mind not quite catching up with her body. The sound of the boat engine hummed somewhere distant, but it might as well have been miles away. They were so close, yet so far. Her arms were trembling from the effort, and she could feel Thomas's panic growing with every second they didn't reach the boat. She felt it in his touch, in the urgency with which he pulled her toward him, pulling her higher into the water, closer to the surface. The blood was still clouding around them, a red halo in the clear water. She was faintly aware of the fin, long dark, cutting through the water behind them like an ominous shadow, but her focus was faltering. Her vision blurred again, and the once familiar world of the reef now seemed a distant memory, faded and unreachable. Ellie's head rolled back against the water as she took another shallow, rattling breath, trying to steady herself, but it was hard to keep her thoughts straight. The boat, just a few feet away, seemed to drift farther from her the more she tried to reach for it. Her arms, which had once been so strong, felt like lead weights, dragging her deeper into the ocean's cold grip. "Please, Ellie, don't go," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking through her fog of pain. She heard him, but it felt like it was coming from somewhere far away, somewhere she couldn't quite reach. "Please, I need you." Ellie's breath hitched, the last of her strength ebbing away. She wanted to tell him she was okay, to tell him it would be fine, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat burned, and every breath sent sharp, stabbing pain through her chest. Something in her body snapped. Then, a final surge of energy, primal and raw. She fought, kicking weakly, her hands grasping at Thomas's, clinging to him with all the strength she had left. She felt his fingers tighten around hers, felt him pull her with a desperate force that almost ripped her from the water. There was something in his eyes now, something so raw and real that Ellie didn't want to let go. She couldn't. "You're not alone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're gonna make it, Ellie. Just hang on." Ellie wanted to believe him, but her body betrayed her. The pain was too much. The fear was too overwhelming, and in that instant, her head dipped below the water again, darkness threatening to consume. Her but Thomas, never letting go, never stopping, pulled harder. His hand was on her back now, pushing her upward. Ellie couldn't see, couldn't think. She only felt the pull of gravity in reverse, the push of air, the sensation of moving towards something solid, something real. And then, in a last burst of effort, Ellie broke through the surface of the water. Her face slammed into the cool, hard edge of the boat as Thomas hoisted her up, lifting her with an incredible amount of strength. He was practically dragging her now, his hands shaking as they reached for anything that would help. "Get her in. Now!" Lena's voice screamed from the boat above, breaking through the chaos and panic of the moment. The sudden splash of waves hitting the boat was like a distant echo, but it was enough to make Ellie's fogged mind grasp at the sounds. "Come on, Ellie, I've got you." Thomas's voice was urgent, shaking. He was lifting her again, his arms trembling under the weight of her limp form. "I'm not leaving you, I swear." Ellie felt herself being pulled upward, her body being hoisted over the lip of the boat. Her arms flopped uselessly, and her vision was narrowing. She felt like she was slipping away again, her body sagging against Thomas as he lifted her with all his strength, lifting her into the boat, The moment she was aboard, her body collapsed onto the deck with a sickening thud. She could feel the hard surface beneath her, cold and unforgiving. Her breath came in shallow, wet gasps and her head swam, the darkness creeping back. No, 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 no. Thomas's voice cracked, his hand pressing against her face, desperate to keep her awake. His touch was frantic, his movements erratic as he checked for signs of life, checking her pulse, her breathing, everything. Ellie, please, don't do this. Ellie's lips barely moved, but she felt something stir inside her, a flicker of recognition, a pull to hold on just a little longer. She tried to focus, tried to open her eyes, but everything felt out of reach. She could hear them, now Lena and Jackson, shouting over the engine, coordinating the rescue, calling for help, but their voices were distant. Distant like the ocean itself, pulling her away, taking her into the depths. Her hands twitched, the motion so slight it might have been unnoticed by anyone else. But Thomas saw it. He saw it, and the relief that flooded his face was enough to make Ellie feel something she hadn't in what felt like forever. Ellie, he whispered, bending close to her, his voice barely audible. I'm here. You're safe. You're going to make it. We're getting you home. Her eyelids fluttered, her breath shallow and broken, but she could hear him. She could hear Thomas, and something deep inside her grasped at that thread of warmth, that thread of life. She had survived,